Can I call Professor Daniel Wincott, please?
Professor Wincott, if you could just repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Could you start by giving us your full name, please?
My name's Daniel Edward Wincott.
Professor Wincott, thank you for attending today and assisting the inquiry. Can I ask you to, when you're giving your evidence, keep your voice up so that we can hear you, but also so your evidence can be recorded? And if I ask you anything that isn't clear, ask me to rephrase the question. Professor, you are currently a Professor of Law and Society in the School of Law and Politics at Cardiff University, is that right?
I am, yes.
We also see from your report, which we'll come on to in a moment, that you hold undergraduate degrees and master's degrees from the University of Manchester and also a PhD from the London School of Economics. Is that right?
Yes.
You are also a Fellow of the Learned Society of Wales and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. And I understand you've published extensively on a range of subjects, including on the law and politics of territorial governance in the UK and comparatively, as well as on public attitudes to devolution. Is that right?
It is.
You've published or contributed also to a range of reports, articles, papers and other public domain material that is relevant to the response of the Welsh Government to the Covid-19 pandemic. I think mostly focusing on the implications of the response to COVID for devolution and also the UK's territorial constitution.
I have, yeah.
You've prepared at the inquiry's request a report that we can see at INQ 0004119927, and that, as we can see there, is entitled Welsh Government Core Political and Administrative Decision-Making in Relation to the COVID-19 Pandemic. And at the bottom of that first page is what is described as an author statement, where you refer to your report, to your duty as an expert to provide independent evidence, and to the fact that the opinions expressed in the report represent your true and complete professional opinion on the matters to which they refer. Is that right?
It is.
And we can see there also the date. It's dated 16th of February this year. So, Professor, as the title of your report suggests, you've been engaged by the inquiry to help explain the Welsh Government's core political and administrative decision-making during the pandemic. And before we look at that in detail, I should say we're going to reduce your report in full, in its entirety, and we can see it's fairly lengthy, contains an awful lot of very helpful information and detail. We're not going to, in the time available this morning, be able to cover all of the topics in your report, but what we will try to do is cover the central themes. And before we do that, just want to be clear about the mechanics of how your report was put together. All right, that you were initially instructed last year to prepare a report, and that was on the basis of your own understanding of the matters identified in your instructions and materials that you could find in the public domain. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And then more recently, as the inquiry has obtained its own evidence, you've been asked to look at some, but not all, the evidence that the inquiry has obtained relating to the issues in your instructions. Is that right?
That is right, yes.
So, for example, the inquiry has provided you with witness statements that it's received from the Welsh Government's various directorates and key decision makers, such as the First Minister.
That's right, yeah.
Now, you set out at page 84 of your report, we don't need to go to it, but there is a list of the materials that were provided to you by the inquiry, which you've relied on, and then at page 86 you set out the other references upon which you have relied. So are those the principal materials you used to produce your report?
They are.
So, Professor, I'd like to start with a few questions about devolution in Wales, so as to provide some context and set the framework for the core decisions that the Welsh Government took during the pandemic. Once we've done that, we'll look at the arrangements and structures that were in place in January 2020 at the start of the pandemic, and then before we turn to some of the key events, and also look at how the Westminster and Cardiff Bay governments dealt with each other during the pandemic. So starting with devolution, at paragraph 54 of your report, we don't need to have it displayed on the screen, you describe the model of devolution in Wales as passing through a complicated and politically contested series of reforms, and you specifically reference the Government of Wales Acts 1998 and 2006 and the Wales Acts of 2014 and 2017. Now, in summary, is it right to say the Government of Wales Act 1998, that established a devolved legislature in Wales, the National Assembly for Wales, which at that time had no primary lawmaking powers?
That is correct, yes.
Then the Government of Wales Act 2006 gave the National Assembly power to pass its own primary legislation under a system by which limited competence was conferred on I think you describe it as a piecemeal basis, and that's often referred to as the conferred powers model. Is that right?
Yes, that's the first stage of the conferred powers model.
Next, chronologically, we have the Wales Act 2014, and I think I'm right in saying that that extended the National Assembly's legislative competence in relation to certain tax matters, and then the 2017 Wales Act, and that changed the system from a conferred powers model to a reserved powers model, and that's consistent with the models that were adopted in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Have I got that broadly correct?
That's broadly right. I would add one further change, which was the change under the Government of Wales Act 2006 from the initial model, which moved powers piecemeal to Wales in a series of fields, and then what were called full legislative powers following a referendum in Wales, where the full range of conferred powers were given at the same time. So it's been a complicated and constant process of change.
Well, as you say, I think you describe it as a complicated and politically contested series of reforms. Could you just describe in a few sentences for us how a reserved powers model operates?
So, in principle, it means that the devolved Parliament or legislature is able to pass legislation on any matter at all, except for those matters that are reserved to the Westminster Parliament. It's correct to say, I think, that model is in Wales has made Wales more similar to the position in Scotland in particular, but the list of reservations in Wales remains much more extensive than the list of reservations in relation to Scotland, and that means that the system in Wales is more constrained in the range of things it can do than the system in Scotland.
Thank you, Professor. In a moment, I'm going to take you to a table that sets out some of those conferred and reserved powers, and we'll have a look at that then. Just by way of another contextual topic, which is that of the mechanics and the structures that give effect to devolution. If I can, I want to group these into three areas. The first, legislation, which, as we've already touched on, is the source of devolved competence. Second, the financial arrangements between the various nations. And then third, the arrangements made for intergovernmental discussion and collaboration. And if I may, I'll just take those in that order. So legislative competence first. We've already looked at how that's evolved in Wales, starting with a conferred powers model and before changing to a reserved powers model. Is it right to say, at least in principle, that Westminster retains the right to legislate on devolved matters, but normally will not do so without the consent of the devolved legislature?
Yes, that's right.
And is that informal constitutional convention, that's what we've heard known as the Sewell Convention?
That's right, yeah.
So in respect of Wales, this means that the Senedd must give its formal approval, often in the form of a legislative consent motion for the Westminster Parliament to legislate in areas under devolved competence.
That's correct, yeah.
Now, Mr. Gove, in his evidence to the inquiry in Module 2, has said that although he is and remains a strong supporter of devolution both across the UK and in England, he also believes that the backstop powers of the UK government need to be strengthened. And he has said in his evidence that the pandemic revealed the weakness of a devolution settlement that failed to reserve key powers to the UK government to act in an emergency. Do you have any comment on those statements?
I certainly think the pandemic revealed some weaknesses and ambiguities in the devolution arrangements. It's not clear to me that those weaknesses relate to the formal ability of the Westminster Parliament to pass legislation in devolved areas. There was, even during the pandemic, legislation passed at Westminster for which consent was sought, but that consent wasn't given, and nonetheless the Westminster Parliament passed it, like the UK Internal Market Act. So the not normally provision in the Sewell Convention, is invoked at the discretion of the Westminster Parliament.
Changing tack slightly, in broad terms, can you explain the role of the UK government in policy making in Wales under the devolution settlement? So does the devolution settlement mean that the UK government and the Welsh government really share overall responsibility for policy decisions that impact Wales, each within its own area of responsibility?
So I would say, yeah, each has its own area of responsibility, and normally they deal with those areas as two governments which govern Wales.
So as we've touched on already the boundaries of Welsh competence, and it's section 108A of the Government of Wales Act 2006 that sets out the extent of the Senate's legislative competence. And I don't propose to go through that in detail, but as I said I would. I'll show you a table. And this is a table that was prepared by Professor Henderson, who gave evidence in Module 2. We see it at INQ 000269372, and it's page 12 of the report. And this is part of Professor Henderson's report that was entitled Devolution and the UK's Response to Covid. And we see there in the table, it identifies devolved policy areas. Now, first up, we can see they are not all common. There are areas where one government has a power and others do not, for example. We obviously are only concerned with Wales in the third column. We don't need to go all the way down the list. Perhaps the most important for our purposes is the first. You see there, health and social services. So this is a devolved matter in all three devolved administrations. And we can also see in this table other areas such as education, local government, transport and housing. They're also devolved areas in Wales. If we can turn over the page to page 13, please. Here we see the other side of the coin, namely powers that have been reserved to Westminster in relation to each of the three devolved administrations. And again, we can see that the position is not uniform across the three nations. We can see the first three, again, looking obviously specifically at Wales, Constitution, Foreign Affairs and Defence. So none of that fits as precisely into our experience of the pandemic as health, as we just saw over the page. But certainly one can see in each of those the question of borders, certainly, which is something we will come back to look at. Just returning then back to your report, and we don't need to have the paragraph up, it's paragraph 44, you refer to jagged edges. That is to say, situations where policy objectives or areas of responsibility overlap or span between devolved and non-devolved areas. Where situations transcend policy areas, so an obvious example being the pandemic, does this mean that the policy outcomes in Wales can to some extent be impacted by decisions of both the Welsh Government but also the UK Government?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we're going to come on to one of the most significant, which relates to public spending. But
We'll certainly come to funding and public spending in a moment. Does that create, in your view, uncertainty about the extent to which Welsh ministers are responsible for the outcomes of decisions in their names?
I mean, I think Welsh ministers are still responsible for outcomes of decisions in their name. I mean, for any government, there's a sort of limited bandwidth, limited range of things that any government can do. So governments have to make choices, and some of the choices in the context of the pandemic were particularly stark. I think that the Welsh government is particularly constrained by the nature of the devolution settlement and those jagged edges and its relationship with the UK government. So Welsh government ministers, I think, are still responsible for their decisions, but they exercise that responsibility within, I think, particularly tight and in some respects uncertain constraints.
Does the existence of what we're calling these jagged edges also mean it's perhaps easier for decision makers in the Welsh Government to attribute blame for bad policy decisions to the UK Government, and also vice versa? I think some have referred to this as creating an accountability deficit. Have you experience of this?
I mean, I think there can be confusion over accountability. I think there is often a tendency to kind of use other parts of the UK and in Wales, what's happening in England, as a yardstick. So to note when there's a sense that Wales is doing better than England, and I'm not sure that's always with respect to a particular yardstick. I think somewhere in the report, certainly in some of the materials I saw, there was reference to Wales doing more testing than England at a relatively early stage I think in some of the core COVID group minutes. And I'm not sure that's a helpful yardstick. And there are certainly blame games played. So that's a feature of the system. And again, I think we may come on to this. The institutions for working together are much less well developed than would be optimal in a system like the UK system. Although I would say, just very quickly, there are lots of examples of governments working together effectively, going back through the history of devolution on, for example, city deals where the UK government and the Welsh government have kind of collaborated on specific matters.
We'll certainly come on to intergovernmental relations and the JMC structure and things like that in a moment. But just sticking with this question of the consequences of granting devolved powers, is one of the, would you say, automatic consequences of granting devolved powers and decision-making authority to the Senedd policy variation? And if that is the case, what, in your view, are the main benefits and disadvantages of policy variation?
I think devolution is a machine that creates policy differences or divergences where governments in different parts of the UK take different approaches. There's a certain amount of concern about different paths being taken for the sake of difference, but the basic principle, and I think this is reasonably well established and has been recognised, for example, by the Supreme Court, is that the devolved parliaments and legislatures are authentic democratic bodies, and that they authorise governments to pursue their own policy agendas. So, I mean, I think it's a legitimate part of the devolution system. Potentially, it can have benefits of policy experimentation. So, something can be tried in one place and then adopted in other places. I mean, an example that isn't related to COVID that's often cited here is the use of plastic bags in supermarkets, which is now no longer routinely done in the way it used to be done. I think that's So I think it is a system that generates divergence, and that in a sense is its part of its rationale.
As you say, it's an automatic consequence, isn't it?
Yeah.
If we turn next to the second mechanism and structure that gives effect to devolution, so these are what I mentioned earlier, the financial arrangements between the UK government and the Welsh government. In broad terms, matters of national finance are reserved. But obviously that poses the question, how is Wales funded? And at least one of the answers to that is to be found in what is known as the Barnett formula. Now, we mustn't let this become a devolution or an economics seminar, but can you please explain in a few sentences what the Barnett formula is and how it works?
Right. So, I mean, the Barnett formula is sort of used as a phrase, is used in a number of different ways. Strictly, it's to do with the how levels of the block grant given by the HMT, the Treasury, to the devolved governments, how changes to that are calculated. Broadly speaking, the block grant system is the crucial element, and essentially that's under Treasury control and gives block grants to the devolved governments, including the Welsh Government, based on levels of spending for England on matters that are devolved to Wales. So the Treasury decides what's devolved, works out how much has been spent in England, and then gives a population share to Wales. That process is really, I think, about the Treasury maintaining control of the big macroeconomic features of the UK economy. It tends to happen sort of retrospectively, so that the level of the block grant depends on what's actually spent in England on devolved matters. It's also important to note that, and this is quite unusual in international comparison, that there are no constraints placed on how the devolved governments can spend the block grant. So if the UK government spends more on health or on education for England, devolved governments can take that consequential and spend it on whatever their priority is in their area. But it does mean that the scope for what you might call demand-led spending in Wales is not present in the same way that it would be present for the UK government in relation to England. So they couldn't suddenly find another big demand for spending and simply borrow or otherwise find the money to spend on it. They're strictly limited to the grant that they have.
And does that point you've just made there, does that create an extra complexity then to the whole question of what powers are devolved?
I think it does. Thinking about this in preparation for this session, I think a characteristic of the Welsh Government is a certain sort of conservatism, a reluctance to take on liabilities that may be open-ended. So, for example, in an unrelated area, the Welsh Government hasn't had the rail system devolved to it. There was a moment when that might have happened, and the Welsh Government didn't want it, I think because it was concerned about the liabilities of maintaining an old railway stock. There are a number of other examples of that kind that might relate to aspirational, quote unquote, aspirational legislation that I've described in the report, where if legislation grants rights which have financial consequences, then there's a kind of open-ended commitment created there. And I think the Welsh Government has often been reluctant to make those kinds of commitments, and that's related to the fact that it doesn't have the capacity to necessarily meet open-ended liabilities due to the nature of the financial system. I'd also say that in relation to the block grant system, or the so-called Barnett formula, I think there's a fairly general consensus that Wales has done historically relatively less well compared to levels of need in Wales than, say, Scotland has done from the block grant system. And again, I think that's been reflected in a relatively recent innovation of the adding of a so-called needs-based element to the block grant calculation for Wales, which is unique to Wales. I think some politicians in Northern Ireland are quite keen on having it implemented there as well. So,
and that needs-based element, that was something that was introduced in 2018, 2019. Why did Wales have a higher need than the other nations of the UK?
I think it's partly to do with socio-demographics and older population. It's the nature of the economic base in Wales. There are very few high-rate taxpayers in Wales. For example, levels of poverty are relatively high in Wales and so on. So it's those kinds of needs.
Now, Professor, we might come back to briefly touch on funding again when we talk about the fire break, perhaps after the break. I want to now move to intergovernmental arrangements, the third of the mechanisms and structures that I referred to a moment ago as giving effect to devolution. Starting with the UK government, all of the devolved administrations have their own territorial Secretary of State, and Simon Hart was the Secretary of State for Wales during the pandemic. What would you describe as being the primary role of the Secretary of State for Wales?
I think, formally speaking, the Secretary of State for Wales is supposed to represent Wales in the UK government and represent the UK government in Wales. Would you like me to expand on that a little bit? Well, I think there is a sense that this is a role that's perhaps somewhat left over from the pre-devolution arrangements. Again, in the report, I quote Robert Hazel, who's a former civil servant and a professor at University College London, a report he wrote very early on after devolution, where he imagined that the territorial secretaries of state would be consolidated into a single post, or certainly the Scottish and Welsh ones would be, because it wasn't clear to him, and it's not entirely clear to me, quite what that role is.
Certainly during the pandemic, so September 2021, we know that a UK ministerial post of Minister for Intergovernmental Relations was created, and that post was occupied by Michael Gove. But prior to that post, Mr Gove had already been playing a liaison role between the UK government and the Welsh government in his capacity as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Perhaps you've alluded to this already, but how did Mr Gove's role vis-à-vis the devolved administrations fit with the role of a territorial Secretary of State?
I think there was some tension within the UK government. I've certainly seen documents that have been released to me through the inquiry that suggests there was some difference of view within the UK government as between Mr Gove in that role and the territorial secretaries of state, who I think felt somewhat sidelined by the liaison role that Michael Gove played with the First Ministers and Deputy First Minister in Northern Ireland.
And from the your own research and from the materials that you've seen, to what extent was the Secretary of State for Wales involved in pandemic decision-making in Wales?
So I don't think the Secretary of State for Wales was heavily involved. I've seen some material that suggests that he relatively early on saw himself as having a kind of a supervisory role that he requested from the First Minister, that the First Minister organised meetings with businesses and maybe trade unions in Wales, and that this seems to have been viewed by the First Minister and the Welsh Government as a sort of an issue that needed to be managed and a diversion of attention from things that they were already doing. I mean, there's quite a lot of material on the role of the Shadow Social Partnership Council, which is had already been set up in Wales and was kind of ramped up through the pandemic, where Welsh Government ministers and officials met with businesses and unions, but also civil society organisations and a range of other actors on a regular basis. So that kind of activity was happening, and happening anyway. And I think the First Minister kind of thought that it certainly didn't seem to be a functionally productive relationship.
In terms of the architecture that was in place prior to the pandemic for the governments of the four nations to come together, as we mentioned earlier, there was the Joint Ministerial Committee, the JMC, which was established in 2001 by a memorandum of understanding agreed by all four nations. Is it right to say that JMC was intended as a forum for dispute management where the four nations of the UK could come together and resolve any disputes?
Yeah, it was certainly intended to manage the relationship between the governments. I think its kind of formal dispute resolution role developed, sort of emerged later. But I would also say that I'm not convinced it ever functioned effectively as a dispute resolution forum.
Well, I think you say in your report, excuse me, as you refer to the JMC as offering a limited and light touch form of intergovernmental relations, and then you say you see it as part of the devolve and forget mindset. Can you briefly explain what you mean by this?
I mean, I think there's a general consensus amongst sort of specialists who study these things that the JMC system was relatively underdeveloped and weak by comparative standards. The JMC for Europe was the formation that met most regularly and worked most effectively. And devolve and forget is a sort of aphorism that is part of kind of Whitehall terminology that simply suggests that matters were devolved to Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, and then not really followed up on in Whitehall, and that the standard kind of operating practices for governing England, which, you know, in some ways understandably is by far the largest part of the United Kingdom, just continued within Whitehall, so that it was as if nothing very much had changed in Whitehall by dint of devolution.
Now, the inquiry has heard evidence that there were no JMC plenary meetings during the pandemic, and Mr. Johnson said in his witness statement to Module 2 of the inquiry that he chose not to meet with the First Ministers of the devolved administrations because, in his view, this would have been optically wrong, for fear that this would give a false impression that the UK was a federal state. And Mr. Johnson says in his witness statement to Module 2, that is not, in my view, how devolution is meant to work. What's your view about that statement?
I mean, I think that's quite an extraordinary statement, really, not least because Mr. Johnson himself contradicts it later on in his statement when he talks about the Intergovernmental Review, and the Intergovernmental Review precisely set up as its apex forum a meeting of the Prime Minister with the First Ministers of the four devolved governments. I think there's a, you know, one can obviously read too much into individual words, but I think there's a political significance in the change in that IGR review from talking about devolved administrations, which is again the standard language of Whitehall and of government in London, to devolved governments, which suggests more of a level of equality. You know, you might imagine if you were working for the UK government and told you had to deal with the devolved administrations, that you were dealing with a subordinate level, or a level that you needed to supervise, rather than, you know, a government that was dealing with core central government policy matters in Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland. So there's an internal contradiction there, and so I mean, I wouldn't speculate on what was going on in Mr. Johnson's mind as he wrote the document, but that optically wrong seems to me to be a very strange way to talk about part of the management of a pandemic. Really, sorry. I just note one other thing. You know, I think in his statement, Mr. Johnson talks about the meetings between Michael Gove as CDL, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and later Minister for Intergovernmental Relations, and the First Ministers as being the equivalent of a JMC. But it's quite striking then that in the annex to his report, he lists those meetings as ad hoc and informal. So, if the JMC is the formal set of arrangements that should be used and that I think several senior civil servants recommended should be used, it seems odd and inconsistent then to treat the organisations, the meetings that he was saying were the equivalent of the JMC as ad hoc and informal meetings. Again, it seems like a fairly low-grade way of managing what, at least in Wales, would be seen as kind of an important part of the management of the pandemic.
So would it be right to say that your view would be that the CDL meetings or calls that happened over the pandemic, they were not a suitable substitute for JMC plenary meetings?
It's certainly in formal terms that's correct, although the historical record of the formal meetings of the JMC don't necessarily suggest that would have been an effective forum for dispensing or making decisions. Again, I don't want to rush ahead, but the ministerial implementation groups, which had all the authority of UK government cabinet committees, had devolved representation on, and participation. And whilst I can see, and in his own witness statements, Michael Gove has elaborated on the tensions and the lack of a perfect system and so on, I can see that might be a cause for concern of other UK government ministers in relation to bringing devolved governments into decision-making, into the heart of UK government decision-making. That was a mechanism that I think achieved that to a much greater extent, either than the plenary JMC might have done, unless it was constituted or put into action in a way that was marked a difference with respect to previous operation of JMC plenary.
Professor, can I just interrupt for a second? Perhaps play devil's advocate. Mr. Johnson is obviously a unionist.
Yes.
And we don't have four nations that are autonomous, entirely autonomous, and have just come together for mutual defence and the rest of it. So surely his argument would be that the United Kingdom government is technically the government for the whole of the United Kingdom, and therefore you don't treat the First Ministers, I'm not saying this is my argument, I'm just putting forward a possible contrary argument, you don't necessarily treat the First Ministers as you would treat the Prime Minister of country X that have come together with country B and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and I'm not...
Wouldn't that be the unionist argument?
Right. So I'm certainly not arguing that that there weren't kind of difficult choices to be made between different ways of involving devolved governments in the management of the pandemic, that there would be costs to them and so on. Aside from the ministerial implementation groups, though, it seems to me that the arrangements did mean that the devolved governments in general and the Welsh Government in particular were kind of informed about rather than involved in decision-making. I don't think you would necessarily have to have kind of suggested that the four parts of the UK had come together for mutual defence only to make that kind of argument. Sorry, I'm stumbling a bit here.
No, maybe we can summarise it in this way, perhaps, that whatever your argument that Mr. Johnson would promote about unionism and not, as it were, treating the First Ministers in normal circumstances as equals, because technically in law they're not, whatever ones the arguments may be. But in a pandemic, your argument is whatever you may normally think about how these arrangements work, in a pandemic, because you've all got to work together, then you've got to make sure you have proper arrangements. Does that summarise it?
Well, I certainly think that's right, that in a pandemic one might expect, other kinds of rivalries or differences of view to be put aside, and that's an argument that could be made to any of the principles involved here. I suppose I'm struggling a bit with what is meant by a unionist argument, because someone can be a unionist, as the First Minister in Wales is a unionist, and still argue strongly for devolution and the involvement of devolved leaders in core decision-making processes in a way that would be, in fact, it might be quite a strong unionist argument to say there should be more of an apparatus for managing the relationships between the governments, which respects the responsibilities of each government. You might think of it more as a kind of argument that might be made by people by those political parties that want to leave the UK, that they don't want to be too entangled in arrangements for UK government as a whole. So unionism can include what you might call a I won't try and call it that, a unitary view of the union, and it can include a devolved view of the union. And I think Mr. Johnson's view is a very unitary view of the union, which emphasises strongly the role of the central UK government. In that world, then one would want to see rather more care and attention and interest paid to matters in Wales in this case, or Scotland and Northern Ireland in other cases, than it seems to me is evident from the documents I've seen. I've seen, for example, and it's not just political, I think it also influences the civil service. So if you look at the advice given by Sir Mark Sedwell and then by Helen McNamara and Simon Case, you see initially discussion of how the devolved administrations, as the documents say, would be involved, and then at the latter end, it's about how the DAs would be managed, and it's not clear to me that a workable system of devolution can be that has legislative parliaments can be properly governed if the UK government sees itself as managing the devolved administrations.
Thank you very much. Long time since I've taken on a Professor of Law, and now I know why. I shouldn't. Anyway, thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yes, I think devolved waters run deep, Professor, and we will move away from devolution now and talk about Welsh Government decision-making structures, if we can. And if I could please have INQ 0000666086 on the screen. This is the organisational chart of the Welsh Government as it entered the pandemic. So at the top, we can see the First Minister. Underneath, we then have the various Welsh ministers and deputy ministers. We then have, at the time, Sian Morgan, who's the Permanent Secretary who leads the Welsh Civil Service. And then beneath the Permanent Secretary, you have the four Director Generals. So at that stage, there were four groups. The Office of the First Minister and Brexit Group, Health and Social Services Group, Education and Public Services Group, and the Economy, Skills and Natural Resources Group. So, first of all, we can see from that there are fewer groups than there are Welsh ministers. So a corollary of that is that the groups are not led, so to speak, politically by a designated department-type cabinet minister. Do you see that as an advantage or a disadvantage when it comes to effective decision-making?
I mean, again, I'd say, the risk of sounding like an academic again, there will always be advantages and disadvantages. I mean, I suppose a disadvantage might be less capacity for a political minister to drive through a particular policy objective, with the support of a committed group of civil servants. I suppose the advantages would be more in the area of joining up, linking up across different domains of Welsh Government activity.
Does the structure of the Welsh Government have any implications for the significance of special advisors to Welsh ministers?
Yes, I would. I think ministers and all the governments in the UK rely very heavily on their special advisors, but I think they do play a particularly important role here. Given that you don't have a kind of senior civil servant team around each minister.
Now, in terms of decision making during the pandemic, you make a comment in your report. You say that before you were given access to the inquiry material, your impression was that the decision-making processes in Wales during the pandemic were, in your words, overly complex. But then having worked through the full body of material that you've been given access to, you say a rather more coherent pattern of response from the Welsh Government has come into focus. I just want to ask you, your initial impression then of over-complexity, was that due to the sheer number of entities and mechanisms within the decision-making structure, or your understanding of the decision-making process, or a combination of both?
So I think it's a combination of both. The Welsh Government did have a number of structures kind of within the government, but also kind of advisory government structures. I think this reflects a kind of orientation of the Welsh Government towards working in partnership. You'll hear quite a lot about kind of co-production and partnership working in Wales. But I think it also reflects the relative lack of specialist academic work, or what you might call kind of long-form journalism, specifically focused on Wales. By contrast with Scotland and Northern Ireland, Wales doesn't have a strong Wales-focused media. Almost all the newspapers in Wales are essentially the London editions, whereas even the London-based newspapers in Scotland will have distinctive Scottish editions, and that has all sorts of implications for communication and for messaging and so on in Wales. But at the early stage, because there's relatively little academic research, I was really heavily reliant on what I could find that the Welsh Government had produced in the public domain, and then on journalistic accounts. And I have to say that, for example, some of the materials produced by Andrew Goodall, who's listed as Director General Health and Social Services Group, but is now the Permanent Secretary, are amongst the most kind of complete and comprehensive accounts of Welsh public administration that exist anywhere. I think so. Reading, I kind of understood the system as it operated, but it hadn't really been set out in that kind of detail in any scholarly articles. The community of scholars focusing on these things in Wales is relatively small, much smaller than, say, in Scotland.
I understand. Pressure by way of orientation, you deal with the initial period, January to March 2020, starting at paragraph 104 of your report. I don't need you to pull it up. But in terms of that period, so the first few months of the pandemic, in respect of four-nation approach, there was, you say in your report, very much one of cooperation between the four governments of the UK, leading up to and including the first lockdown. Is that a fair summary of your assessment of that period?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. Although I would also say that there were incidents of kind of friction even during that period of cooperation.
And I think you've mentioned some of those in your report, and
Yeah.
we will obviously have regard to those. If we just go through the various factors within that, we know that during that period, January through to March, there were a series of COBRA meetings, initially chaired by Matt Hancock as Secretary of State for Health and subsequently by Mr Johnson. Now, there is a debate about whether the right person from the Welsh Government attended. We know Mr Gethin attended the first 3 COBRA meetings. Mr Drakeford's first attendance wasn't until the COBRA meeting on the 18th of February. Now, I don't want to spend time on that now, but as a general point, the Welsh Government was invited to and did attend COBRA meetings, whether in person initially or remotely. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
One of the products of those early COBRA meetings was the Coronavirus Action Plan at INQ 0000666061, which we can see on the screen there. That's the first page of the action plan, published 3rd of March. Now, the first point to note, just from that first page, not only does the title explain that it's a guide as to what you can expect across the UK, but then immediately underneath that box are the illustrative logos showing that it's the work not just of Westminster Department of Health and Social Care, but the 3 devolved governments, so including, of course, the Welsh Government. If we can please go to page 10 of that action plan, that sets out the well-known, as we see it, para 3.9, contain, delay and mitigate. And then the paragraph above, 3.8, it reads, the different phases, types and scale of actions depends upon how the course of the outbreak unfolds over time. We monitor local, national, international data continuously to model what might happen next over the immediate or longer terms. Would you agree that this anticipates, this action plan in early March, that there might be variations in response to the virus?
I would, absolutely. I would just note one potential ambiguity in this paragraph. It says we monitor local, national and international data, and it's not clear what local and national mean in this context. So does national refer to the whole of the UK? Does it mean they're monitoring each of the nations, as it were, of the UK? Does local include localities in England and then the devolved parts of the UK? So, you know, this is a standard way of talking about these data, but the complexity of the UK doesn't kind of necessarily sit neatly in that kind of language.
No, Professor, and the questions you ask are good and valid questions, and we'll be hearing evidence later in these hearings from people that had a hand in drafting and input into this document. So we spoke earlier about policy variation being, I think, in your words, an automatic consequence of devolution. So this appears to be expressly recognised in this action plan. Then if we can have a look, please, at page 17, paragraph 4.40, we see there a reference back to COBRA, and to 4 lines up from the bottom, the respective crisis management mechanisms across the devolved administrations have also been stood up and will operate in very similar terms to that of COBRA within their own nations, and all 4 coordination centres are linked up on the UK planning and delivery response to Covid-19. So it's fair to say, looking at that, would I be right that the plan at that stage, this is early March 2020, was very COBRA-centred? COBRA would be the place where the governments of the 4 nations would come together and would pursue a combined response to COVID.
Yes.
I'd like to just change topic slightly and ask you some questions about the UK government's legislative response to the pandemic and particularly how that impacted on the Welsh government's strategic response. So we know that at the start of the pandemic, the UK government had on the statute books the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, and that provided ministers with the ability to take emergency powers in the event of a catastrophic emergency and appoint governors, for example, for parts of the UK. Now, it also had on the statute books the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984, which provides that regulations may be introduced to manage an infection which presents or could present a significant harm to health. Now, as we've already touched upon, under the Civil Contingencies Act, decisions would be made, and you deal with this in your report, by the UK government, and the Welsh government would be a Category 1 responder, so effectively implementing those decisions. In contrast, Public Health Control of Disease Act, public health obviously being a devolved matter, Welsh Government would be the entity making the actual decisions for themselves, correct?
Yes.
So did the choice of which legislation to use to respond to the pandemic, in your view, did that have important implications for Wales and also the type of structural response to the pandemic across the UK?
It did, yeah.
I think you refer in your report at paragraph 105 to the First Minister's evidence to the inquiry that he expected the UK government to take the key decisions for the whole of the UK, and that you refer to the fact that Mr Drakeford's expectation was that civil contingency powers would be the primary instrument used to respond to the pandemic, and that this expectation was one that you say was generally held across the devolved administrations. Now, we know that the decision was made by the UK government to respond to the pandemic through the use of public health powers, and also the powers under the Coronavirus Act. And you'll be glad to know I don't intend to get into the fine detail of the Coronavirus Act with you, which of course addressed all sorts of issues relating to emergency measures that were taken and lockdown and so on and so forth. Would you, though, agree in general terms that one of the purposes of the Coronavirus Act was to facilitate a coordinated and consensual approach across the UK, but also whilst at the same time facilitating deviation where necessary?
Yeah, I think that's right.
So that act, the Coronavirus Act, that's really of a piece with the approach that we've been discussing relating to, just a moment ago, the action plan. It anticipated a four nations approach. Yes?
Yes.
Now, the reason that this is of some interest is that latterly there has been some debate as to whether that particular sort of legislative approach was the right one to have chosen. And as we've just seen, and as you refer to in your report, it's not one that the First Minister anticipated. Now, Mr Johnson, in his witness statement to Module 2 of the inquiry, and perhaps we can have this up on the screen, it's INQ 000255836. And this is, yes, page 30. This is Mr Johnson's report at paragraph 126. He says, looking back, we should have thought much harder about the legal basis for the measures proposed. There's a respectable argument that we should have used civil contingencies legislation rather than public health legislation. By allowing for the appearance of divergence in approach between the various parts of the UK, we were risking considerable public confusion and frustration when clarity of message was crucial. And then perhaps just one further paragraph of his witness statement, paragraph 153, which is page 37, please. So 153, I think we are about four lines down. It starts, it would perhaps have been better in retrospect if we had formed policy under the Civil Contingencies Act 2004 so as to bind the UK together. We should then have met regularly, UK government and DAs, to decide the policy together and stick to it. Now, we know from evidence heard in Module 2 that COBRA was advised that it wasn't open to the UK government to use the Civil Contingencies Act to the pandemic because it wasn't an unforeseen event. And so the Public Health Act powers were used. Now, the important point to draw from what Mr Johnson is describing, so namely an alternative legislative response, would have seen, would it not, a very different response to the pandemic?
It would have seen a different response to the pandemic, yeah.
And we know from what the First Minister has said, and you've picked up in your report, that once the decision was made to rely upon public health powers as the basis for responding to the pandemic, the First Minister agreed with that decision. His words were, it allowed the Welsh Government to calibrate a response which reflected the particular circumstances in Wales. But that decision, that UK government decision to use public health powers, was not formally made until the 20th of March. So is it fair to say, from what you've seen, that up until then, up until the 20th of March, it appears that the Welsh Government and the First Minister had assumed the primary decision-making power would remain with the UK Government?
That certainly seems to be the First Minister's understanding of the situation. I have to say that, trying to track through references to different kinds of powers during that early phase is complicated, and I remain a little bit unclear about exactly when kind of decisions were or exactly how these matters were discussed, how far they were aired, and so on at any earlier stages. So there are references to public health powers, I think, in some earlier documents. But so there's a certain lack of clarity for me, which I haven't been able to resolve, I'm afraid.
In light of everything we've looked at and discussed, do you feel able to comment on whether the First Minister's assumption that this would be effectively Civil Contingencies Act powers rather than public health powers was a reasonable assumption to hold? Is that something you feel able to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say it was, kind of broadly speaking, reasonable based on what I understand of the situation. I've also seen in some of Michael Gove's evidence, as in-person evidence, as it were, to Module 2, he's made reference to Michelle O'Neill, the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland at the time, also expecting civil contingencies would be the basis of the power. So I think it's reasonable that was a fairly widespread view, including across a range of different kind of political perspectives.
Let me move on, but in so doing, return to a topic we've already touched on, which is the question of funding. Now, in your report, paragraph 113, you refer to the UK government's coronavirus job retention scheme, so that's the furlough scheme. You describe it as providing the foundation for pandemic governance across the UK, including Wales. Now, we don't need to go through the detail, but in summary, the consequence then of the Barnett mechanism that you described eloquently to us earlier was that where the UK Treasury set up these extremely money-intensive schemes, so furlough, bounce-back loans, business interruption schemes, and so on, the Barnett mechanism meant that there was extra funding for Wales and the other devolved administrations. Is that right?
I'm not sure that's quite right. I mean, things like the furlough scheme, the coronavirus job retention scheme, were UK-wide funding streams so that people across the UK could draw on them, and they were drawing on Treasury funds. The block grant consequentials came from spending in England on matters that weren't also covered in Wales. And a colleague of mine in the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University, who works in our Wales Fiscal Analysis Unit, wrote a report published in November 2020, where he said at that stage it looked as if in Wales there wasn't disproportionate spending from those central funds as compared to spending in England. So the idea that, as it were, more was spent in Wales from those central funds, I don't think, at least for that first phase of the pandemic, I don't think stacks up.
I understand. And I think you explained earlier that Barnett funding, it's not ring-fenced. So in other words, Wales doesn't need to spend it in the same way that England has spent it. But you refer in your report, and I don't think we did touch on this earlier when we're dealing with funding, to the introduction by the Treasury of a Barnett, or sometimes I think called a coronavirus guarantee. Just in a few sentences, could you explain first what that is and why you think that is particularly important in terms of the pandemic response in Wales?
Okay, so that relates back to what I was saying previously about how the block grant is based on spending outcomes in England, so that if spending is allocated for England and not actually spent, then any block grant consequential can be clawed back by the Treasury. So effectively what the coronavirus or Barnett guarantee did was it gave the devolved governments comfort that where the UK government was allocating substantial funds for coronavirus purposes in England, that those funds would be allocated to Wales and the other devolved governments and not clawed back at the end of the period. So an example would be the UK government allocated a huge amount of money for its test and trace system. The test and trace system implemented in Wales was much, much cheaper, but the Welsh, even if all the billions of pounds, I can't remember exactly what the amount was, I shouldn't say billions of pounds, but even if the substantial allocation wasn't spent in full, that money wouldn't be clawed back from Wales, so they could then confidently allocate it to whatever purposes they felt necessary, without the risk of being clawed back. This goes back to my point about the kind of anxiety about open-ended liabilities that I think is a kind of significant feature of the devolved arrangements as they work in Wales.
We spoke a moment ago about the involvement of COBRA in those early months of January to March 2020. Just want to take perhaps a step to one side again and talk about SAGE, so the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, because you make a few points about SAGE in your report that I just want to look at with you.
I'm sorry, could I just make one other point, which I think is really quite an important point about the structure of public spending and how that affects pandemic response? I mean, not for this pandemic, but thinking about the future.
Of course.
If we imagined that coronavirus had arrived first in a population centre in one of the devolved parts of the UK, there's no straightforward mechanism whereby the additional spending required to deal with that as it first hit would be generated in the UK system. So, we know that coronavirus hit in London first, and the response was keyed around dealing with that issue. But if say a group of academics from China had visited a university in one of the devolved cities, and that had been how coronavirus had first hit, it's not at all clear how the emergency spending would have been generated. I suppose it would have had to have been going to the Treasury and asking for some special funding, whereas because it hit in England initially, it was fielded by the standard UK government arrangements. I hope that's not.
That's very
clear and helpful.
So just returning to where I was on SAGE, and really a few points that you make about SAGE in your report. I think there are three in total. First, you make a point about membership, and you, excuse me, you refer in your report to paragraph 119, to the fact that relatively few people who work at universities in Wales sit on SAGE or its subcommittees, and you say, in contrast, proportionally larger number of academics from Scottish universities are member of SAGE. Briefly, just expand on that point and why you make that point in your report.
So I think in her report, Professor Henderson kind of talks about SAGE having a kind of English frame of reference, I think that was sort of partly mitigated by the presence of people who were kind of living with the experience of coronavirus in Scotland, but to a much lesser extent in England. And obviously that doesn't affect, academic scientists are on SAGE for their substantive expertise, and it doesn't matter in that sense where in the UK they live. But if they're bringing their experience to bear, at least on the margins, I think that might be significant. I think there's a broader issue about the way that data on England tends to dominate UK-wide data, and there are often issues about on surveys the sample size in Wales being too small to say anything meaningful about Wales itself, and so on. So I suspect these are the kinds of thoughts that were behind Professor Henderson's remark about the kind of England frame of reference.
I think another point you make about SAGE is that from what you've seen, Welsh officials and experts did not have direct access to minutes and papers directly from SAGE and its subgroups. although I think it's fair to say that access to SAGE materials did improve. And I think from 8th of April 2020, the Welsh Government was given access to an online repository of SAGE documents. Now, the inquiry is going to hear quite a lot about the Technical Advisory Cell and the Technical Advisory Group, TAC and TAG, that was set up in late February and comprised scientific and technical experts that provided independent scientific advice and guidance to the Welsh Government. One of the driving forces behind establishing TAC and TAG was that the advice and guidance from SAGE was not Welsh-specific, as we've just discussed. Rather than creating a completely new advisory structure in the midst of a pandemic, could an alternative approach have been to seek to address some of those problems that you've identified with the SAGE structure with the UK government? Or do you think it was an appropriate or necessary response to set up a new advisory structure in late February?
I think it was appropriate to set up the TAC-TAG structure. The alternative of negotiating with the UK government to change SAGE isn't one I've considered in any detail. I suppose I think it kind of goes with the grain of the sort of public health approach to managing the pandemic, although I'm trying to work out the timeline here. It may be sort of in advance of, may have been set up in advance of the First Minister understanding that the public health legislation would be used. I don't have the dates in front of me, so I can't work out that time order.
Well, I think TAG and TAC was set up there or thereabouts end of February, and I think the evidence might suggest that it's the 20th of March that it becomes apparent that the UK government is going to use the public health powers rather than the Civil Contingency Act. Now, we're going to explore data and modelling with other witnesses. But because you make one comment in your report, I just want to ask you briefly about that before we take a break. You say the availability of data and capacity to analyse it in a sufficiently timely fashion to inform policy making was a continuing issue across the UK and in Wales. Perhaps reflecting the structure of the sector, these issues seem to have been particularly acute in relation to social care. Just, as I say briefly, in your view, are you able to say why that was the case?
So structurally, the organisation of social care across the UK, means it's very much a kind of mixed provision. A lot of independent provision, increasingly less local government directly provided social care. And that means that you're gathering data from a range of different charitable or commercial enterprises, and so having comprehensive data on the sector, I think, has proven difficult across the UK and was I think difficult in Wales, and I think that's been acknowledged. And there are kind of data strategies for social care in Wales and so on. That were developed subsequent to the pandemic, as I understand it.
My lady, I'm going to change topics, so therefore that might be a good place for a break.
Professor, I hope you're warned that we take a break we always say for the benefit of the stenographer, but I suspect it's for the benefit of everybody. I shall be back at past.
All rise.
Paul.
Professor, I want to next ask you some questions about the Welsh fire break, which, as we know, started on Friday, the 23rd of October 2020, ended on the 9th of November. Now, you deal with the Welsh fire break in a section of your report starting at paragraph 225. Now, we know there are supporters and there are critics of the fire break, and the evidence as to how effective it was is unclear. And I don't want to discuss any of that with you, Professor. I want to, though, explore two aspects of the fire break. First, continuation of a theme, differences in government responses. And second, again, returning to the impact of funding. The Welsh fire break is perhaps, would you agree, the clearest example of the Welsh Government adopting a starkly different policy to the UK Government and the other devolved administrations?
It is starkly different. I mean, I think there was something a bit like it in Northern Ireland, but very different to the other governments in Britain.
Perhaps we can just have a look at minutes of a COBRA meeting of the 12th of October, INQ 0000083851. And if we could perhaps please go to page 7, paragraph 11 of those minutes. See here, First Minister asked if COBRA would be held to discuss circuit breakers, which he noted the SAGE papers had regularly advised on. And then same page, further down, paragraph 16, Prime Minister said that the issue of circuit breakers and the ability to keep schools open were particular points of interest. Continued success was said to be heavily dependent on individuals' behaviour. The challenge lay in successfully encouraging a tired and frustrated population to absorb new messages. Those minutes can be taken down, thank you. From what you have seen, would it be fair to say that the UK Government had very little appetite for a circuit breaker?
Yes, I think that's right. There's some very clear evidence in Boris Johnson's Module 2 statement that is very sceptical about circuit breakers, and specifically, critical of the approach in Wales, and actually contrasts it with a tiered approach in Scotland.
Indeed, and I think you refer in your report to the UK Government's Eat Out, Help Out scheme being an example of, you say, the UK Government giving priority to mitigating economic harms rather than COVID impacts. Is that right?
There certainly seems to have been an emphasis on that, especially from the Treasury.
Turning then to the impact of funding on the fire break, and you deal with this at paragraph 227 of your report. And you refer there to the fact that the Treasury did not agree to extend the furlough scheme to cover the Welsh fire break. Now, the inquiry is going to look at that issue with some later witnesses, and I don't want to, with you, debate the rights and wrongs about that particular episode. But just as a general point, would you agree that this illustrates a point that we touched on earlier, namely the difficulties faced by the Welsh Government not having the fiscal levers to support individuals and businesses that could not earn income during the pandemic?
Yes, at a broad level. I mean, I think there was also quite a lot of commentary, ranging from the Financial Times and the Institute for Government through to people like Kelvin Mackenzie, that sort of suggested that the Welsh Government might be pursuing tighter restrictions and passing the bill on to the Treasury, which I think is a serious misunderstanding of the way the finance actually worked.
Thank you, Professor. Excuse me. Throughout your report, you refer to various lessons learned exercises that were carried out by the Welsh Government and also other organisations such as Public Health Wales. Now, the evidence suggests that the period from late summer to early autumn 2020 until the winter months of 2021 seem to have been particularly challenging for the Welsh Government. And one conclusion of a lessons learned exercise carried out by Public Health Wales was that not all lessons identified at the end of the first wave of COVID were actioned successfully, and that's something you note at paragraph 224 of your report. Would you agree that there was an opportunity for the Welsh Government to be better prepared for the second wave of the pandemic in autumn 2020, having been through, obviously, the first wave in the spring of 2020?
Yeah, I've thought quite long and hard about this. And for me, I think one of the tricky things to work through is is how lessons learned in the first wave might be applied in the somewhat different conditions that held from the summer 2020 onwards. I mean, it seems to me that there's a quite fundamental difference between that initial emergency response where, in effect, a very large-scale redirection of the NHS was undertaken in Wales and across the UK, and then from summer 2020, much more of an attempt to keep a more normal range of NHS services going, even through the various kind of lockdowns and so on. So I think there's a danger of a kind of false equivalence when you say there was a lockdown 1 and a lockdown 2 and a lockdown 3. They're actually quite different kinds of lockdowns. Now, that still leaves open the question of learning lessons, and it does make me reflect that I would want our governments to be able to kind of absorb and understand that difference and kind of modulate their response in the face of that difference. There is, I think, quite a lot of evidence that due to things like the condition of hospital infrastructure in Wales, that infection protection and control proved particularly difficult. And there are some reports that say, this is due to the physical layout of hospitals in Wales. Now, I haven't seen any kind of comparative analysis of physical layout of hospitals and how that impacted infection rates within Wales or beyond. But it seems to me there is an important point there that governments do need to learn lessons, but they also need to understand that they're addressing a different policy question, perhaps subtly, but I think significantly different policy question, if they're trying, as I think they should be trying, to provide a wider range of services as the pandemic emergency continued.
Thank you, Professor. Now, a change of topic, and my last topic is going to be public health communications, briefly. You deal with this at paragraph 256, or certainly you start dealing with this at paragraph 256 of your report. And you make the point there, which is a point you made earlier this morning. So compared to Scotland and Northern Ireland, you say the Wales-specific media is weak, especially in relation to newspapers. So printed media is weak, as you explained earlier. Is it right, though, to say that Wales does have a distinct radio and television provision, particularly in the Welsh language? That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, in the Welsh language, and there is also distinct provision in English as well.
And you refer in your report to daily broadcasts of the Welsh Government press conferences, which I think started on the 30th of March 2020. And you describe in your report as BBC Wales reporting an unprecedented demand for its news output, with more than 700,000 viewers tuning in each day. Would you agree that those daily broadcasts were a key part of the Welsh Government's public health communications strategy?
Yes.
Now, in your report, you also note that although Mr Drakeford's popularity dipped briefly in Wales at the start of the pandemic and Mr Johnson's increased, Mr Drakeford's ratings then increased sharply as Mr Johnson's fell. And, excuse me, I think I'm right in saying you're a member of the Welsh election study. And if we can have, please, it's page 79 of your report, INQ 0004111927. Look there at figure 1. This is data, I think, collected by the Welsh election study to compare public attitudes in Wales towards the UK and Welsh government's handling of the pandemic. And we can see there from figure 1 a clear common pattern of higher approval levels for the Welsh government than the UK government in terms of communicating decisions, handling lockdown and vaccine rollout. Overall, would you say that the Welsh Government employed an effective public health communication strategy during the pandemic?
I would say overall it did. I think there were, specific examples of mishandled issues. For example, there were issues around the fire break to do with non-essential items in supermarkets and how they were handled and so on. But in general, I think the evidence is that their communication strategy was relatively successful.
Professor, thank you very much. I have no further questions for you.
Ms Shepherd.
Professor Wincott, I asked questions on behalf of Covid-19 bereaved families for Justice Cymru, and the question that I've got to ask you relates to the evidence of Professor Thomas Hale, which he gave in Module 2 of this inquiry, and the reference is PHT 7030, and it's page 26 of that document. If we could look at the top left-hand quadrant, and it's line 21 onwards. He says, so we see this roller coaster tendency where restrictions are put into place only after it becomes apparent that there will be a very severe threat to the health system. That's after a large amount of community spread has begun. Because it's so prevalent, and it goes over to the next page, at that moment, the restrictions need to be more stringent and to be in place for a longer period of time than might have been the case otherwise. But precisely because sustaining high stringency for a long period comes with costs, there's huge pressure to roll them back sooner rather than later, and that leaves inevitably some residual virus circulating in the population, which lays the seeds for the next wave to emerge. So this kind of tendency to act too late in the first instance and to take measures away too soon in the second instance does tend to lead to the peaks and troughs that these graphs show. And then just very finally, the bottom left-hand quadrant, line 17, he says, so the countries that were riding the roller coaster were, I think it's supposed to be suffering from a trifecta of large health impacts, high, long periods of stringency and negative economic consequences. So do you consider that this criticism of only implementing NPIs when it is too late, resulting in this roller coaster approach whereby restrictions are ended too quickly, only to be ramped up to maximum, is applicable to the Welsh Government's response in autumn 2020?
So around the fire break?
Say from September 2020 onwards.
So this was a phase when local area restrictions were first put in place and kind of spread around Wales, and then moved to the fire break. I mean, I think there was certainly sage evidence of advice that a circuit breaker should be implemented, and I think that might have been implemented earlier in Wales. I'm not sure the extent to which the Welsh Government was trying to or anticipating a kind of more general move to a circuit breaker across Britain. So that may have been one of the things that slowed down that response. And I'm also not sure exactly how and why circuit breakers seem to get identified as 2-week periods. Seems to me that one of the critical things about a fire break or a circuit break is that you pre-announce when it's going to end, and that was a very clear feature of the fire break in Wales, that the government seemed very strongly committed to pre-declaring what would happen afterwards, and that became mixed up with the UK government then introducing its lockdown that wasn't called a fire break, that lasted longer, a month, but also pre-announced when it was going to end. I think there was quite a lot of confusion there. It's also unclear to me, simply because this isn't my area of technical expertise, what the relationship between that fire break and the emergence of new variants of COVID, which came through September and then became much more prevalent at the end of that year and through the next year, the so-called Kent or Alpha variant and so on. So exactly what the mix of the causes of the significant increase in infections and deaths towards the end of 2020 and into 2021 would be, I can't determine. But I think there was a sense of a sense that firebreak might have been introduced earlier. There may also have been concerns about funding it as well that influenced the timing. And again, kind of referring back to a previous set of discussions, it is striking to me that when the UK government introduced the lockdown at the end of October, beginning of November, the Treasury increased the proportion of the furlough that the government paid from 60%, which it had been in October, to 80%. Again, apparently responding to things in England. Sorry, I'm mixing up things here.
I just want to ask one follow-up question to that, and it's whatever the reason...
Only if it's within his expertise. I was worried, as you know, Shepherd, that I should never have given permission for this question, because it's not really within this witness's expertise. So first, what's the question?
I was going to ask, no matter the reason for the Welsh Government implementing the firebreak when it did, was the ultimate result that Wales was in a situation where we're having this ramp-up, ramp-down rollercoaster of
I think, to be honest, that's more from an epidemiologist or a scientist,
Thank you, Melody.
as opposed to a professor of law and politics. So I'm sorry, but I think I have to stop you there.
Thank you, Melody.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Professor. I'm sorry if we did stray beyond the expertise. It's my fault. I shouldn't have given permission for that question. But thank you for your help anyway. And I'm sorry we can't have a longer seminar.
Thank you.
If I can please call Professor Sir Ian Diamond.
Yes, that's right. I'd like you to take the Bible in your right hand, please, and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you for your continuing help, Professor.
It's a privilege to have the opportunity again.
Could you please start, Professor, by giving us your full name?
Yes, I am Sir Ian Diamond, and I'm the National Statistician.
Now, you are in fact Professor Sir Ian Diamond. I was proposing to call you Professor Diamond. Is that?
I am very happy for you to call me whatever you wish.
Professor Diamond, I think you know the drill from Module 2, but if you can keep your voice up so that we can hear you, but also so your evidence can be recorded. If I do ask you something you don't understand, please ask me to rephrase it. Now, Professor, you have been good enough to provide a detailed witness statement for this module, Module 2B. We can see it there on screen. You signed that statement on the 8th of January of this year. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
You also provided 2 witness statements to Module 2, and you also gave evidence in Module 2 on the 10th of October, and the transcript of that evidence is obviously available on the inquiry website. If I can start, though, with just a few questions about yourself. You are the Chief Executive of the UK Statistics Authority, and since August 2019, you have been the National Statistician. Is that right?
That's right.
You are also Head of the Government Statistical Service and Analysis Function. And in that capacity, you provide, am I right, overall leadership for the Office of National Statistics and the statistics profession across the UK government.
Yes, I would just clarify I'm Head of the Government Statistical Service, and I am also Head of the Government Analysis Function. They are 2 separate. The analysis function includes the statisticians, but also includes economists, operational researchers, social researchers, actuaries and geographers.
I'm grateful. If we can start then, please, with some questions about generally data gathering in the UK, but also Wales. Dealing first then with the UK Statistics Authority. What is the UK Statistics Authority?
So the UK Statistics Authority consists of the Office for Statistical Regulation, which is the regulator of statistics, but more importantly for this, the Office for National Statistics, which is the operational arm of the UK Statistics Authority. And the Office for National Statistics has a responsibility to provide official statistics across largely the economy and population and society, and to produce those statistics in order to provide the evidence on which policy can be based.
And can you please describe to us the way in which the UK Statistics Authority operates in relation to the UK government, but also the devolved administrations?
Yes, I can. With regard to the UK government, the UK Statistics Authority is independent of government, although we do have a line to the Cabinet Office, but we are entirely independent and have a board with an independent chair, Sir Robert Choate. Statistics is a devolved responsibility to the devolved administrations, and I, though, still have, you may call it a pastoral responsibility to the three chief statisticians of the devolved administrations, and we meet regularly and we talk, and we have a concordat between the ONS and each of the three devolved administrations, where we agree to work together to provide statistics where appropriate, which have comparability right across the United Kingdom.
So in the case of Wales, the chief statistician for Wales during the relevant period was Glyn Jones, who was then succeeded by Stephanie Howarth, who we will be hearing from a bit later on. And during the pandemic, did you have much contact with the chief statistician for Wales?
Yes, very much. I personally had contact in a number of ways, both formal, so that the Inter-Administration Committee, I know that's a mouthful, meets quarterly, and that includes everyone to talk. In addition, we had informal contact whenever that was necessary, and we met on regular bases. I would also say that my colleagues across the Office for National Statistics had very regular meetings with colleagues in the Welsh Government. Indeed, around the large COVID infection survey, they were meeting daily to discuss results and to discuss potential analyses. I would also say that we try very hard to produce statistics for the Welsh Government in some areas, particularly mortality. In other areas, we are ready to respond to requests.
Now, Professor, I'm right in saying that you attended a SAGE meeting on the 16th of April 2020, and the importance of understanding the R number, or the reproduction number, and the community prevalence for the following 2 to 3 weeks was discussed at that meeting. And you understood that this information would be crucial information that would inform government decision-making. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
And following that SAGE meeting, the ONS was commissioned to deliver the Covid-19 infection survey that you've just referred to. Can you just tell us what's the importance of the Covid-19 infection survey?
At that time, colleagues may remember that test and trace was, I think the best way to say, stretched, and indeed GP services were very stretched. Therefore, we did not have an accurate measure of how much COVID was in the population, what the proportion of the population was who at any moment were positive. And that's, as a statistician, when I was asked what one would do, I'm afraid the knee-jerk reaction is to say, let's do a survey. And at that time, it was unclear on the 16th of April whether one could do a survey, a household survey, where one could do swabs and get that level. But I felt it was possible, and my colleagues rallied round. Government said, let us do this. And so we started, we drew a sample, we recruited a large number of people. For the first 3 months, I would have to say it was England only, because this was a pilot. And we ran a household survey which enabled us to estimate the degree of positivity. With regard to this module, it was successful, and so we then started to do it for Wales and started to produce data on a weekly basis for Wales. And the logistics of going to a household, taking the swabs, then getting them to the laboratory, getting the results, and it is not simply, I would say, a question of, if you like, ticking positive not and then dividing by the number. There's quite a lot of statistics that goes into estimating the prevalence, and we did all that, and we made estimates twice a week.
And just to put some dates on that, I think I'm right in saying that the COVID infection study started April 2020, yes. But as you've just alluded to, I think fieldwork didn't commence in Wales until late June. I think
that's right.
29th of June. And then it started producing infection data for Wales beginning of August. Why was there that delay in respect of Wales?
Well, it was, I would say, not a delay. As I indicated in my last response, we went into a pilot initially. It wasn't clear whether people would respond. It wasn't clear that we could get the logistics right, so it was right to do a pilot. And when it was clear that this was a successful pilot, that's when other devolved administrations decided they wished to join, and Wales was the first of those.
And how did that survey ensure it was able to appreciate the specific types of data that the Welsh Government would need?
Well, as I indicated, Welsh Government statisticians were at our daily meetings. They were also at weekly meetings that happened, and we aimed always to respond to requests. So if there was an analysis that Welsh Government statisticians wanted on that COVID infection survey, then either at the daily meetings or at the weekly meetings, they could say, these are matters which are important to the Welsh Government. We really need to get some information on them.
And how was information from the COVID infection study conveyed to Welsh officials? Was it through Welsh statisticians attending meetings? As you
No. We're formally through. I mean, because of the importance of pace here. I mean, at times, for example, as one moves forward, some of the Omicron variant, doubling time was about 2.5 days. So one couldn't wait a long time before letting government know the results. And so what we agreed with the regulator was that we would let management information go to government, and that typically went on a Tuesday evening, although we published a couple of days later. Why did we publish a couple of days later? That's because there was still quality assurance that needed to be done and work needed to be done to really make sure that everything was fine and to get it ready for publication. But the broad data, a slide pack of a rather large number of slides, went to government right across all 4 administrations, went to the Welsh Government every Tuesday evening, and they then had those data to work with immediately.
Now, Professor, I want to ask you some questions about ONS statistics on fatalities. Now, I appreciate, as we said earlier, you've given evidence in Module 2, and I don't want to make you repeat everything that you've said, but there will be some people following your evidence today who won't have seen your evidence in Module 2 or be familiar with it. By way of a very brief overview of ONS data on fatalities during the pandemic, is it right that throughout the relevant period, the period we're concerned with, there were 2 main published data sources available on deaths?
Sorry, I thought you were going to tell me what they were. I'm quite happy to tell you.
I'm quite happy. No. Perhaps if I tell you what they are, and then you tell me if I got them right. There's the Daily Department for Health and Social Care COVID-19 deaths data. That's published 2 p.m. daily for the UK. Is that's right?
That's right.
And that data was drawn from NHS England, Public Health Wales, Health Protection Scotland, and Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland. And then the second source, ONS weekly death registrations data for England and Wales. And that was what was released every Tuesday at 9:30 a.m. And that related to the week that ended 11 days prior.
That's right.
Have I got that right?
Exactly so. And the distinction is that the ONS data cover all deaths. and with all places of death, whereas initially the DHSC data were for hospitals, first point. The second point is that they are, the DHSC data would be on the day the hospital was recorded, and so what you tended to find, and I think DHSC data are really good at very quick estimates, is that at weekends not so many are recorded, so there was always a bit of a weekend gap and then a lag. The ONS data for there, our data come on date of registration, and we receive them, and we're able then to produce them with cause of death, because the death certificate, as you will be aware, has the opportunity to write a cause of death and an underlying cause of death, and that's where we got much of, almost all of our information on COVID mortality, whether the physician registering the death recorded COVID either as the prime or underlying factor.
So, Professor, which measure, the DHSC data or ONS data, would be more accurate or more helpful to understand what was happening in Wales during the
Well, I think they're
pandemic?
both. I think they're both helpful. So during the pandemic, you would be getting the DHSC data very quickly, on a daily basis. The ONS data, which I would argue have, if you like, more granularity, give more place of death, and clearly more cause of death, that comes on a weekly basis, so it's a little slower, but at the same time gives you an enormous amount of information. So I do think it is important to recognise that, very often in statistics, we're able to provide quick information, which we are clear about what the pluses and minuses of, while a little later you have, if you like, a much more detailed and better information. If you're happy to wait those 11 days, as most people were, then that's what I would use.
Understood. Now, the inquiry understands that on the 31st of March 2020, the ONS gave an exemption to provide the DHSC with provisional data on deaths registered weekly in England and Wales. And I think the idea was that that would help ministers better understand the spread of COVID-19. Was an equivalent exemption made for provisional data to be shared with the devolved administrations? Obviously, specifically, we're concerned with the Welsh government.
Not clear, and I would need to check on that.
Now, before we address fatalities, can we just look at Welsh demographics as they were in 2020? And you outline in your witness statement a number of data points estimating Welsh population demographics in mid-2020. Just before we come to those figures, can you just explain how those estimates were developed?
Sure. So in 2020, we were working from the 2011 census using what we call a cohort component method to update year on year. That basically means we start with the 2011 census, we add on births, we take off deaths, and we make an allowance for migration. I'd have to say that by 2020, you're about as far away from the previous census that you get. We are still very proud of those estimates, but then in 2021, we did an unbelievably good census in Wales, and so there will be a distinction between 20 and 2021.
Now, turning to the actual figures, and you set these out at paragraph 11 of your witness statement for this module, and I don't need you to turn it up, but the estimated usually resident population for Wales in mid-2020 was 3.17 million.
Yes.
What is the importance of the usually resident measure for somewhere like Wales?
Well, I mean, put pretty simply, that doesn't include houses, for example, that are second homes. So, we don't have people there. There may also be people who report that, they are working or living somewhere else, but maintain a house in Wales, which may be their first house. So the usually resident population is one that we use a lot. Sometimes local authorities make a point of saying, well, actually, we want to know how many services to deliver. So let us take a place like Cardiff. The number of people usually resident, shall we say, on a Sunday evening is rather different to the number of people that Cardiff has to provide services for on a Wednesday lunchtime. And so the usually resident population is a clear distinction of those people who are there, not necessarily those people who will be there at different times during the day and week. And of course, does not include people who are short-term visitors, e.g. tourists.
Now, you say in your report that the median age of the population of Wales is 42.4 years. Are you able to help us with how that compares to the UK as a whole?
Yes, it's a little older. And indeed, Wales has a slightly higher proportion of people over 65, and I think it's worth saying.
And in terms of demographic spread, how does that compare to the rest of the UK?
Well, Wales is a very heterogeneous place. So what you have around South Wales, and particularly around the old mining areas north of Cardiff, is a very highly dense population and one with relatively high degrees of deprivation. On the other hand, as you go north from there or west, it becomes a very rural population. As such, you have a real mix. So that South Wales area looks not unlike, for example, the area going from Manchester across to Leeds and around, whereas the northern and western group, much more like the Lake District.
Professor, you produce a number of figures also in your witness statement about Welsh economic activity. Where do those figures come from? Is that the census or the two censuses?
Well, partly from the census, where we're able to ask people what do you do and what proportion, but we also run a labour force survey, which is a very large survey which tells us about activity and inactivity, and those data we use as well.
And it's right to say, isn't it, that a greater percentage of usual residents aged 16 and over in Wales were economically inactive compared to those in England?
That's absolutely right. And again, this is one of the reasons that I spent a little time a moment ago talking about the geography of Wales. A lot of that inactivity is in that area, that old industrial area to the north of Cardiff.
Changing topic slightly and talking about four nations cooperation now, if I may. At the very beginning of the pandemic, so January to early March, you say there was less immediate contact between the UK government and the devolved administrations. Can you just explain a bit what you mean by less immediate contact?
Well, I think initially, as I indicated earlier, we do have good relations, but statistics is a devolved responsibility. We meet as chief statisticians quarterly, and initially the Welsh Government with statisticians was working on Welsh Government issues. We were much more focused into Whitehall, and it was only as things started to evolve that we said, come on, we need to get together here and really work together.
Were there any specific challenges or delays in establishing collaboration with Wales and the Chief Statistician for Wales?
No.
Excuse me. I'd like to now move on to talk about mortality data, if I can. If we can have, please, INQ 000396876. And this is Table 6. This, as it says at the top, death registrations involving COVID-19, March 2020 to February 2022, UK, England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and regions of England. In terms of what we can see in that table, Wales has the second highest age standardised mortality rate of deaths involving COVID-19, 144.6.
So just before you go on, Mr. Paul, can we just say, involving COVID, does that mean COVID appears on the death certificate?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lady. So that was greater than the UK average, which was 143.2. England slightly higher at 145. Was that difference between Wales and England, would you say that's statistically significant?
No.
On the other hand, was Wales's age standardised mortality rate significantly higher than the rates for Scotland and Northern Ireland?
Yes.
Now, it might help to break this information down by wave. Can we please have Table 13 from your Module 2 witness statement, which is INQ 000271436, please? So the table straddles those pages. And what's the source of this data, Professor?
So what we are looking at here is what we call excess deaths. And what one is doing there is taking the difference between the deaths that occurred and a measure of expected deaths. Now, that's the measure that you might expect to have had. And for this table, what we were doing was taking the mean of the deaths in the previous, in that week in the previous 5 years. So you take the difference between the two, and of course that can be either positive or negative. If it's positive, then you've got more deaths than you would have expected, and if it's negative, then fewer. And in this case, we are reporting for those particular periods much higher mortality than would have been expected.
If we can just see a few things from this table. England had the highest percentage excess death registrations when looking at the whole time period, and also 2 of the 3 lockdown periods, so the periods March to June 2020 and January to May 2021. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
And this was true when looking at excess deaths using either numbers of death registration or age standardised mortality rates.
That's right.
During the second lockdown, so August to December 2020, we can see Northern Ireland had the highest percentage above average when looking at numbers of death registrations, but in fact Wales had the highest percentage when looking at age standardised mortality rates. Is that right?
That's right.
Meaning that when one controls for the age composition of Northern Ireland and Wales, Wales fared the worst during the second wave than
during
all
the
other
second. Yeah, no,
devolved.
you're absolutely right. During the second wave, mortality in Wales was the highest of the 4 administrations across the UK.
If we can please look at another chart, it's INQ 000412042. This shows excess weekly deaths in Wales. Can you perhaps describe what we can see in this chart, Professor?
So what this chart does is not only give you the picture of excess deaths, but by using different shades, and in this case the blue are those deaths which involve COVID. And so what you can see, I would suggest quite clearly, are 3 things. Firstly, in that first wave, there was a very strong peak of deaths in April 2020, and that peak, the excess, was largely driven by COVID. The second thing I would say, and you've just referred to it, is a very high peak in the autumn of 2020 and early part of 2021. And again, that was largely driven by COVID. And the third point I would make is that following those 2 very, very big peaks, the numbers of deaths later on in 2021 and into 2022 do not have those peaks of excesses, while sadly there remain a number of COVID deaths marked in blue due to a number of things: improved treatment, improved the brilliance of vaccination and other things. The actual mortality due to COVID went down greatly, while at the same time as some of the new variants, I'm thinking particularly of the Omicron variant, came in, the actual proportion of the population who had COVID got very much bigger than it had ever been before. So if you go back to March, April 2020, the proportion of the population overall, we would suggest, with COVID was relatively small, but if you got it, particularly if you were old or frail, then very, very sadly, the prospect of mortality was high. By the end of the period, the probability of actually having COVID had increased, but due to all those factors, vaccination, better treatment, and indeed perhaps the evolution of the virus, the probability of mortality had reduced greatly.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Professor. Can we please have another chart on screen? It's INQ 000412.042. I think it's at page 2 of those slides. This is showing daily deaths with COVID-19 on the death certificate, comparing Wales and then comparing it to the UK. What does this comparison show us, Professor?
Well, much, I would have to say, as what I've said previously, I would say also very clearly that we have put different y-axis scales there, so they're not a complete comparison, so don't think that the numbers in Wales were rather bigger than the numbers in England. But it's making the point, I think, very, very clearly. Firstly, that the trends largely mirrored across the UK and in Wales, but secondly, you really can see that big peak towards the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, which is the point we've just been making about mortality in Wales sadly being rather bigger than anywhere else during that second wave. If we can move then to talk about deaths in Wales by age, and do so by reference to another chart. It's, I think it's the same INQ, but page 7. Yes, I'm grateful. This shows age-specific death rates involving COVID-19 by a 5-year age group in the period March 2020 to June 2022. Can you please just talk us through what we see there? What does this tell us about the age distribution of COVID-19 deaths in Wales? It tells us very, very simply that mortality in Wales was very largely restricted to the elderly. Now, we know from other places that often there were comorbidities that may have played a role in mortality for younger people. We don't see that very much. Now, that's not to say clearly there are small numbers of people aged 40 to 44 and 45 to 49 who very sadly would have died, but basically what this is showing is that mortality in Wales was restricted to the elderly. Now, I think you conducted your own work into excess deaths per age group, and you set this out helpfully in your witness statement, and to show the effect of COVID on different age groups compared to deaths in non-COVID years. Am I right, if I was to summarise the work you carried out, as concluding that the highest excess mortality was observed in those aged 45 to 49 years old, with age-specific rates between this period, March 2020 to June 2022, being recorded as 16.8% above the 5-year average? I think that's right, but I would have to say, and it comes back to the point I've just made, and I'm not trying to make a statistical point, but if you have a very small number, then it doesn't take a very big number for that to be quite a big proportion. So yes, and you know, you're right. The good news is that people aged 45 to 49 do not have very high mortality, and so that small amount of mortality is a relatively high percentage, but it does not, as that graph that I've just talked to shows, become a high mortality compared to those older ages. I understand. If we can move then away from age and focus on place, if we can have the chart, thank you, it's page 8 of the same document, and just talk us through again what we see there, in particular, if you could, the negative figures for hospital and hospice. Right, well, what we are looking here is at the excess deaths by where the death occurred. And I will come, if I may, to hospitals and hospices, but if I could just make a point about the positive ones first. We saw a significant increase in deaths at home. Now, some of that could be COVID, others of it could be, for example, cardiovascular disease or whatever, where people had not gone into hospital. We also see a significant increase in care homes than we might have expected. And I just want to say a few words again about other communal establishments and elsewhere, because the percentages are high, but as the point I made earlier, they are high percentages of small numbers. And the other communal establishment is a very big group, which includes all kinds of things, including, for example, student halls of residence where there was no mortality or almost no mortality. But it does include sheltered housing. And that's where we think much of that increase comes, where one, again, because people are looking after themselves, although they are very elderly, mortality there is relatively low. And the elsewhere, which includes all kinds of things, does include those people who were pronounced dead, sadly, on arrival at hospital. And again, we would suggest that that could include a wide range of areas, including cardiovascular disease or whatever, but sadly that's there. So let me then return to hospital. The first thing to say is that, yes, the numbers are below zero, but they're tinily below zero. And I might suggest, and can I just stress in what I'm about to say that I am speculating, I do not have firm evidence, but we do know that a lot of illnesses, people didn't go to hospital for all kinds of reasons because the hospitals were absolutely stretched doing wonderful things dealing with COVID patients. And so that could have led to just a small reduction despite the fact that we had looked at those peaks. And very similarly with hospices, I would suggest that people were choosing perhaps to stay at home if they had, for example, sadly, terminal cancer, rather than going into hospices.
Professor, in your statement, and we can take that chart down, thank you. In your statement, you describe how there is only limited understanding of the way in which socio-economic characteristics contributed to deaths in Wales, unlike in England. Can you just start by explaining why that is?
Very simply, in order to make good estimates, there needs to be enough data to make estimates from. And so we did make estimates as best as we could during 2020, often linking mortality data back to the 2011 census. Now that presents problems because if you think about it, many people who were in the 2011 census would have moved home, would have migrated internationally. So we had to use a number of quite complex statistical techniques to be able to make those estimates. And we were able, for example, to make some estimates at that period around ethnicity. We were able then to make longer, we then moved to using data that we were able to get in England from public health, from GP records, and we used those for England in the future. What that showed was a high degree of association between mortality and ethnicity, and mortality and deprivation. And we see that in Wales as well, where we're able to look. And we did not do work following 2020 for Wales, but we did offer to work with colleagues in Wales and offered the code to them. And the 2011 census data were made available in Wales to the SAIL data bank. and to Digital Health Care Wales.
I understand, because I think that links to a question I was going to ask. Stephanie Howarth suggests in her statement to the inquiry that the SAIL data bank that you've just referred to has access to GP data, obviously in Wales. Would that have enabled some parity between statistical publications for Wales and England? Is the lack of this linked information in Wales, in your view, a significant gap in identifying and understanding socio-economic or public health trends?
I do think in terms of mortality, the better you are able to link data, the more granular the information that you can get, and the better that information is.
What have you been able to measure to gain an understanding of socio-demographic trends in Wales?
Well, we were able to look at geography, and I think it is important to note that the areas with the highest levels of mortality, Rhondda, Cynon Taf, and Merthyr Tydfil, are those areas where one would find associations with deprivation and to something you mentioned earlier, inactivity, which could be due to ill health. So we're able to say that. We did find some early data around ethnicity, and we were also able to look at what is called the index of multiple deprivation. Now, this is an index which is put together from a large number of variables, typically those in censuses, and which is able to go to a relatively small geography, and one is able to then, what one typically does is take the 5 quintiles and say, let's go from the areas of most deprivation to the areas of least deprivation. And what we're able to say is that there is a clear gradient between the most deprived and the least deprived areas in terms of mortality.
And do you have any other breakdown of deaths by, say, religion, disability status, or occupational group? If we can please, I think this will...
And I would say, just a point I would make, is that my colleagues would say that they can see no real reason for some of the things in those areas that we found in England not translating across to Wales, but it would be for the Welsh Government to have done that work.
I think, just to illustrate a point you've made, if we can have, please, INQ 000396876, it's figure 5 from your witness statement to this module. And this shows portion of excess deaths by local authorities in Wales. Does that largely accord with your findings about deprived quintiles that you've just referred to?
I mean, I'd say these are local authorities, so if you look at somewhere, I mean, given it's just down the road, Newport, there are some pretty poor areas in Newport, but there are also some less poor areas. So overall, if you look at Newport, it looks like it's in the middle. On the other hand, a place like Merthyr Tydfil is much more uniformly deprived. And so I think it is important when you look at local authorities to understand the heterogeneity in terms of deprivation across those local authorities, so that, and it is also the case, I mean, there's no question at all that places like Powys have very relatively low areas, but let us not pretend that there is not deprivation in rural areas. It's just it can be hidden compared with urban areas.
Understood. I want to move away from mortality data and talk about a bit about infections data. And we touched upon this when we were talking about the Covid-19 infection survey. And remembering then that that only began to publish data for Wales in August 2020. Can we please have INQ 000412042 on display? Thank you. Professor, can you just talk us through what this chart shows?
What it shows is the percentage of the overall population of the 4 administrations who tested positive in any period. Note the 4 arrows to the left-hand side, which indicate, as you've rightly pointed out, when each administration started to collect data. So what you clearly see is an increase in positivity in the autumn of 2020, and I don't know, sir, if we're going to discuss the fire break at any time.
By all means, I mean this accords with the fire break.
Yes,
this
I
period,
just
September
would
2020.
For what it's worth, I will just add it. I didn't know if you wanted to address it later. You can see for Wales that the percentage goes up and then goes down again and then goes up again, and that accords with the fire break that the Welsh Government brought in. Things then flatten off in the early summer of 2021. There is then an increase, and then in late 21, when the Omicron epidemic came strongly in, toward that, you actually see the highest percentages that we have seen. And I would point out that, again, these are national data. And if you were to look at the age-specific numbers, which have higher confidence intervals around them, you do at times get above 10% of the population in some age groups at that time testing positive. Of course, as I've indicated earlier, that has less of an impact on mortality thanks to the brilliance of vaccination and also better treatment. But once you've got very, very high proportions of people who are testing positive and therefore out of work, you're actually starting, or not able to work for that period, you're actually starting to have enormous impacts on the economy. And that is something I think that we need to remember in that latter period.
Thank you, Professor. And we can take that chart down, please. The COVID-19 infections survey was, I think I'm right in saying, able to generate data about likelihood to become infected based on some socio-demographic characteristics. Sure. Is that right?
That's right.
But that data was UK-wide data rather than Wales-only data. Is that right? Can we please have another chart displayed? It's 0003968676. It's, thank you, yes, it's that figure 10. Likelihood of testing positive for COVID-19 by core demographic characteristics, UK 29 August to 11 September 2021. Again, Professor, perhaps you can just talk us through what this chart shows us.
Well, what it shows, and it comes back to many of the points that I've been making, and that is that if you are in a larger household, the probability of testing positive increases. If you are in a more deprived area, the probability of, this graph shows the lower the deprivation, the lower the rate. The opposite of that, clearly, the higher deprivation. Also shows that the big urban areas and indeed the slightly less big urban areas had higher probabilities. And it also shows that there is a variation, but very little difference in terms of the probability of being positive between non-white populations as a whole, people of colour, and the white population.
Well, I was going to move on to ethnicity data. Are estimates able to be produced for mortality in Wales across ethnic groups?
We have produced them for 2020. I'd have to say the numbers of people of colour broadly defined are in single figures, and so it would be very hard to make any strong assumptions, and we have not done it post-2020. You'd need to talk to Stephanie Howarth about that. We have shown for, in that period for England and Wales, that there were strong differences by ethnicity of mortality, and we would argue for a number of reasons that we can't hide from the fact that in our country, people of colour are more likely to live in deprived areas, are more likely to be in multi-generational households, all the kind of things, and are also less likely to be in occupations which enable them to work from home. And all those reasons would have contributed to those factors.
I was talking about mortality just then, but what about infectiousness in Wales? Were estimates able to be produced for infectiousness across ethnic groups?
Well, we found that very difficult, and we tried in many ways. The reason for that is while we've got quite a number of people in our sample, the proportions positive are often very small. And so actually trying to fit strong models becomes very, very difficult because you've got very, very small numbers of people who are positive. So, you've got, once you start getting sort of very tiny numbers of people in different socioeconomic groups, for example, you can't actually model. So we just produce individual data, and we suggest that many of the things we find for the UK as a whole would hold in the four nations.
So does that explain why that it could be done, for example, for England, but it couldn't be done for Wales?
The sample size, I mean, these kind of statistical models are driven by how much data you've got. And the sample size in England was extremely big, the sample size in Wales. And remember that it's not just the sample size, but the proportion testing positive means that you're actually working with relatively small numbers, and that makes estimating some of the models almost impossible.
Now, data gaps, Professor, were identified for those with protected characteristics in Wales by the Equality Human Rights Commission's 2018 paper, Is Wales Fairer? Are you aware of that report and its finding on this question of data inequalities for
I'm aware it talks about disability.
Point to note, I mean, that was a 2018 paper. Moving forward to 2 years during the pandemic, there were no data sets that permitted any meaningful comparison were available for the impact of the pandemic on ethnicity, occupation, religion, disability status. That's right, isn't it?
I mean, disability, I'd have to say, it is a major data gap for our country. And we do have a question on the census, which asks about limiting long-term illness. And that gives you some information, but it doesn't actually help in terms of the granularity as to whether you might be hard of hearing or whether you have musculoskeletal problems. So we do, I believe, have a data gap around disability, and indeed we at the ONS have been trying to engender some conversations about that.
What actions did the ONS take to support the Welsh Government assess the unequal impact of the pandemic?
We offered support at any time. We offered at different times to share some of the code that we had developed, and I'm sorry. And as I indicated, we enabled the census data to be in Wales, and we have the COVID infection survey data, which were held in our secure research service, and Welsh statisticians were able to access those data very easily and very quickly.
Now, a point that we touched on yesterday with Professor Ogbonna, would it assist if ethnicity data was recorded by coroners and registrars on death certificates?
I'm not completely convinced about that. And the reason that I am not convinced about it, let me start by saying I'm 100% convinced that we need to get mortality by ethnicity. But the point I would make is that when one gets to the death certificate, the person who most knows about their ethnicity is sadly no longer with us, which is fine, if it is a very close relative who is reporting, but it doesn't necessarily need to be that. So I'm personally not convinced about putting ever more data onto death certificates. What I would prefer to see is that we had a system, for example, through the health service, which routinely collected good ethnic data and where we committed on a very regular basis to link those data together and to be able to publish differentials in mortality by ethnicity. So let me be clear, I'm 100% convinced about the need to produce more. And not just, I would suggest, ethnicity, I would also add disability, I would add other areas, but I would argue the best way to do it is through having those data available through, for example, the health service, and then linking them in, which we can do very easily and very quickly.
Did you or your colleagues at the ONS collect any data from Wales on long COVID, Professor?
Yes, we did. And it is self-reported. And again, one of the advantages, I would argue, of the COVID infection survey that we've talked about thus far during this morning's conversation is that it was longitudinal in nature. What does that mean? That means that we go back to the same households over time. That enables us to follow up and to ask people, have you still got the symptoms, and what are those symptoms? And that enabled us to make overall estimates for Wales, and to answer perhaps your following question, could you get down to socioeconomic groups? No. But we were able to identify levels of long COVID, self-reported, and that peaked at 4%. 4%, 1 in 25 people reporting that they had experienced long COVID. And that self-report, I'd had it for at least symptoms for at least 12 weeks, and in some cases for a year.
The inquiry understands that information was requested from number 10 about long COVID in February 2021, and from that point the ONS provided updates at DHSC ministerial roundtables on long COVID. Has the Welsh Government made a comparable request?
I'm not clear whether there was a request formally. There was certainly, I'm not aware of a request formally to me, but as I indicated right at the beginning, statisticians in the ONS were meeting on a very regular basis with statisticians in Wales, and those conversations regularly included discussions about analyses which would have been asked for. And indeed, I think the other thing to say about the long COVID is that we were able to make some small disaggregations, and to say that long COVID was more likely to occur amongst women and also amongst those in the more deprived areas.
Professor, just returning to a topic we touched on earlier, about collaboration with ONS and Welsh Government. And we can see from your statement that UKSA and the ONS work closely with scientific and expert groups within the UK Government. And at paragraph 153 of your witness statement, you state that your engagement with scientific and expert groups in the devolved administrations was much more limited. Briefly, why do you think your engagement was more limited with those groups in the devolved administrations?
Well, I mean, very simply, because we, if you like, were not able to just say, I'm coming. And so, yes, we did go and present to the technical advisory cell of the Welsh Government, and we did have conversation, but we are waiting in many cases to be asked, whereas with the UK Government, I was part of SAGE, I was there, as indeed were colleagues from the Welsh Government. I would have to say that also, particularly the Chief Data Officer of Public Health Wales, a woman called Fliss Bynni, attended very many of the same meetings that I attended with, for example, the Joint Biosecurity Centre and all kinds of things. So the Welsh were at many of the meetings, but we only attended, for example, the Technical Advisory Cell when invited.
Professor, just finally then from me, we heard evidence yesterday from Helena Herklot, CBE, that deaths of people in care homes were not counted early in the pandemic. This might well be a question for Stephanie Howarth rather than you, but are you aware of why those deaths weren't counted in Wales?
No. We were able to do, we've looked at the data that I've shown you already, and we do get place of occurrence. What I can't tell you is why they weren't counted initially.
Professor, thank you. They're all the questions I have for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. I think we have some pre-approved alternates. I think it's Ms. Gammon.
Thank you, my lady. Professor, I ask questions on behalf of COVID-19 bereaved families for Justice Cymru. My first question relates to the data available to SAGE to inform its advice, and indeed you've confirmed in your evidence that you were part of SAGE. Do you agree with the evidence of Professor Ayla Henderson in Module 2 that firstly, SAGE focused overwhelmingly on data from England, and secondly, that sometimes data from England was described as UK data for the purpose of SAGE advice?
I would have to say that I would agree that a lot of the data which were looked at were England-centric. I would also, though, say that Welsh, Scottish and Northern Irish colleagues were at every SAGE meeting, and on very many occasions I can recall Sir Patrick Vallance making an effort specifically to bring in those colleagues to ask. And as I said before, the Welsh Government did have a technical advisory cell, and we presented to that cell when invited.
But focusing specifically on SAGE, and you've accepted candidly that SAGE did seemingly focus on data from England, but you've rightly pointed out that there was attempts to draw in data from Wales. What was the breakdown between English-centric focus and the attempts made to bring in Welsh data? Where did it go wrong?
Well, I think, just for absolute clarity, I didn't say that it was totally English-centric.
No,
I did say,
occasion, yeah.
And I would also say that much of the modelling that went on used the COVID infection survey that I've had the privilege to talk about this morning, and that's UK-wide. So much of the data on which, for example, the mathematical models were used was based on UK-wide data and therefore included Wales. So I would not like, with respect, to put a percentage on things. I am conscious that Welsh colleagues, Scottish colleagues, Northern Irish colleagues had every opportunity to input, and that much of the modelling that went on would have used UK-wide data.
Thank you. Moving on to my next question, and for context, the Welsh Government liaised with the UK Government to provide daily aggregate data to feed into the UK Government's COVID-19 dashboard. And with that in mind, do you agree with concerns raised by some in Welsh Government, for example, former Chief Statistician Glyn Jones, that, and I quote, definitions of data items were not always clear at the outset, unquote, and that this, quote, posed a risk of misinterpretation by assuming data across 4 nations comparable, unquote, when that was not always the case?
I don't think it was. I disagree with. Glyn Jones is someone I respect enormously. I think, look, initially there were different definitions. I have no doubt about that, and indeed I got a group together in, I recall June, I think it was June, but in the summer of 2020, said, look, we need, across our 4 administrations, we need a very clear definition. And there were different definitions, and I brought that together and I made it happen. Previous to that, it may be that people misinterpreted, but typically the footnotes would have made it very clear what those data were. I do think, and I've said this many, many times, very early on in the pandemic, there were a lot of data moving around, and I don't think always that the visualization of those data was absolutely brilliant. And we being ONS and many others, worked very hard to move from what I would call a data deluge into insight by moving to really ask questions. I mean, this morning has been an absolutely fine example of that, where you get some really good questions and you can say what the data says about them. And that, I think, was something that happened very quickly, but early, in February, March, early April 2020, there were a lot of data around. It's one of the reasons we started the survey.
And something that we can learn moving forward to take.
I think it's a real lessons learned. There are I mean, I do try to address in my witness statement some lessons learned. I do think that I very much hope there isn't another pandemic like this, but I do believe that the national statistician should be right at the heart very, very early. I do believe that we need to make sure that we are sharing data much more easily and much more quickly. And indeed, I do believe we should be sharing those data now so that we are ready. And I do believe we need very much to be learning. Perhaps, you and your colleague who talked before would not need to learn this. But I think sometimes it is the question that we need to make sure we are asking questions. If you just came and tell me something interesting about whatever, I might tell you something interesting, but it might not be the answer you needed. So really focusing on questions and learning to focus on questions is something that we as a nation need to improve in our data literacy.
Thank you, Professor. And very, very briefly, one final question on the Covid-19 latest insight tool that you've already mentioned. Did that tool incorporate data from Wales and analysis specific to Wales?
Yeah, yes, it did, where in those data sets which were UK-wide. So COVID infection survey, opinions and lifestyle survey, designed UK-wide, able to produce data which would include Wales.
And more specific because it was answering questions, as you've
100%.
Thank you, Professor.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cowan. I think there were suggested possible extra questions, but I've been told what they were. And one of them, I think, about infection surveys in schools could be asked to the next witness because it's a Welsh-specific question. And the other question that I've been told about, I'm afraid, is not for this witness, who's not an expert in public health. So there are no further questions. Thank you very much indeed, Professor. I'm very grateful. I'm not going to give you a guarantee. I'm not going to ask you again to help.
Well, but were you to ask me again, let me be very clear, it is a privilege to be able to answer.
Very kind of you to say so. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you very much.
What time is it? 1:55.
All rise.